Okay, so I should kick us off. Catherine will be back in a minute, I'm sure. Thank you for coming, everyone. I like it when we have a nice little small group. And I should start off by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathering today, which is the Wurundjeri people. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Okay, so for those who don't know me, I'm Jill Scanlon. I've been with Women in Aid and Development for a few years now. Started off just attending events as a volunteer. I'm now on the board and I facilitate the Melbourne events. And we're here. I also teach at ACU in international development, as well as doing various other things across the board in international development and communications as well, and advocacy. I'd like to welcome our guest tonight, Dr. Tanya Militic,
yep.
Right, Militic, yeah. So, who joins us to talk about our topic tonight, which is peacebuilding and peacekeeping. Tanya is an experienced academic and practitioner with a commitment to working collaboratively on real-world challenges, from a conflict prevention, social cohesion to good governance, with an ambition to influence positive change. Don't we all?
Yeah. In good company.
She's the Assistant Director leading the Peacebuilding Initiative at Melbourne Uni, which I'm keen to ask you about. Peace and conflict studies academic who advocates for violence prevention as well as cultural and structural peace building, which is an interesting aspect of what we want to look at tonight. So welcome, Tanya.
Thank you so much, Jill.
Joining us tonight. How did you come to this point? We'll start from that in terms of being a woman working in international development, but coming to this point and getting to the point of we're working in peace building.
Thanks. And it's so nice to be here. And I just want to also acknowledge that we meet on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people, and this is my home country as well, so I feel really grateful for that, and I'm forever learning from that deep continuing wisdom about living in a more ecologically peaceful and sustainable way. And I also am always reminded of how long peace building processes are, as we know from what we're doing in Australia. So it's always good to anchor ourselves in that experience. And so my parents migrated. My mum from Italy is an economic migrant. She's sort of grade 3 education, farmer family, and came for work, and my dad was from former Yugoslavia, and his part of Yugoslavia was in conflict. As a young man, he didn't want to fight, and so he fled and got picked up, put into a refugee camp before eventually coming to Australia. And like a lot of migrants, they didn't talk about the past. You inherit a future, and they worked hard for that. So it was all about education. But of course, like growing up, I was really sensitized to social injustice issues at a very family and community and local level at the time. It's very gentrified now, but Port Melbourne wasn't gentrified, and we went to a school that was considered disadvantaged. And, you know, when I would get upset at school about workmen wolf whistling and the safety of the school, the principal would say, don't ever lose that quality, you know. And on it went, and I didn't have a language for it, but I felt angry a lot. I felt like I wanted to do things that felt like they were somehow part of something that would be that positive change. And so when I was studying, I got into uni on a scholarship here at Melbourne Uni, and I did women's studies and I did psychology, and I thought I'll follow psychology, and found that I ended up working my first job for 5 years, working for an organisation here in Melbourne that was supporting people of refugee background. And at the same time, in the 90s, my father's former country dissolved and was racked with conflict. And I had a Serbian-born partner at the time, Croatian background. It wasn't so great. You know, I went from being beloved Tanya from my partner's mother to the crow, you know, and I just started thinking about, and this is a bit long and you'll all forgive me, but I started thinking about, you know, working on what seemed like the consequences of conflict and violence and the sort of generational impacts. And I wondered, what do people do? So I went back and did some postgrad dip studies. At the time, we had a conflict resolution centre at Melbourne Uni, and I had this wonderful, the former director of that, Di Bretherton. She was my supervisor and remains my mentor, but she encouraged me to look into this. So I did some work with the Croatian and Serbian communities and people who are second, third generation. You know, what made some people feel really engaged in those conflicts while others weren't. And I was essentially looking at, you know, how we make meaning and what happens to our memories in a collective way. And then what do we do from a conflict transformation approach, or how do we build peace in that local way? And from those studies came some initiatives, and that caught the attention of a new program for Peace Fellows to go away and do studies in peace and conflict. And so I was the first, it was suggested that I apply, and that was over 20 years ago. But that's another story. I don't know how far you want me to go.
You tell as much as
Oh,
you like.
all right. So it's
It's
interesting
fascinating to us,
because
but
I
it's
didn't
interesting to
know
us.
you could have a career in peace building. So there wasn't that frame in my mind. There was mediation, alternative dispute resolution, which in Australia and many North American and European contexts, that's really legalistic and important because it's pushing the boundaries of how we address conflicts, not just go into litigative or legal means and trying to make problem solving more relevant and these alternative forms of conciliation and arbitration. But it didn't quite speak to that community context that I was coming from. And so when I did the Masters in Peace and Conflict Studies, I applied to it and had been to Croatia sharing some of the work that I'd done. And one of the centres was based in Berkeley. And I thought, oh, beautiful. I'd met these people doing work in Yugoslavia. That will work out well. And when I got accepted, they said to Tokyo. And I thought, I don't know anything about Japan, and it's not really the trajectory I was on. But like I said, I didn't come from family with money, and it was a fully paid master's. It was exactly in the area I wanted to work in. It just wasn't quite where I thought I'd be. And that's where things really changed for me. I went to Japan and did this course in peace and conflict studies. It was very much from an international perspective. So a lot of focus on the UN, a lot of focus on the multilateral system. And that still wasn't quite what I was hoping to get. And I said it out loud one day. It was about a year into the program. I said, I'd really love to get as far away as I can from concrete, because Tokyo is like a massive city, to get really in a situation where I could learn from people working at a local level, local approaches to peace building. And somebody heard me and said, you know, I've got this friend who runs social services of Cambodia. They're looking for someone with your background for a month. And I went, and that's where, after my studies, I went back and ended up spending, I was just telling Zee, over 10 years working for that organisation. But again, it wasn't where I imagined I'd go, but it was very much the type of work I wanted to do, because this area is really broad. And even though I've got a background in community development, in psychology, and then eventually political sciences, but I found that it wasn't a clear way in, but at the heart of it was always this sense of how can I learn more about what people can do to either address some of the drivers of inequity and conflict, holding in mind the important work that's done to support people in conflict and afterwards. But I was interested more in what are we doing to address some of those, as you call them, cultural and structural barriers, because I didn't have an imagination for it. You know, I didn't have the language or the sort of examples or the stories that tell us more about what we can do to build peace, and not in the fluffy way of, you know, that people often, that gets connotated with peace, but in that really tough struggle to transform processes when there is conflict from that really destructive, harmful approach that we're in a habit of going into, towards more life-sustaining, life-enhancing approaches. Yeah.
So when you say you didn't feel you were equipped, let's say, to do it, was that just a case of, for you, do you feel like experience, or just it's something that it's skill set that has been very specifically learned?
Yeah, I think that we get scared of conflict. A lot of people are really uncomfortable, probably because we have such bad experiences in conflict. And I feel that that's because we're creatures of habit and choice. And even though historically war, violence, conflict get us nowhere, we seem to think that that framing of approaches that is defensive, that is securitized, is somehow keeping us safe, but it doesn't. And so when I say I didn't feel equipped, I didn't know what we do to engage in conflict constructively. And I feel like that's the sort of space that exists around, you know, that sort of spectrum of conflict prevention to peace building. And even though it's less clear, people sort of say, how do you know it works? Because hopefully if it's working, you're not seeing the type of violence that we're seeing. I think that's a really weak response, because the more we're able to, you know, whether it's in the family, interpersonal level, the organisational, I know that all of us here, if we want later on, can tell of woes of, you know, how you grapple with things that are in our institutions, not just between us, and that comes over time. And so a lot of that work, I think, is not just reverting to, or people have conflict or they have problems. Actually, so much of our ways of thinking, our ways of understanding, power sharing, resources and so forth, play out at the very micro level as well as at the macro level. So I think it's a great field because it can hold people from a whole lot of disciplinary backgrounds, a whole lot of sectors, and it basically is about how can we engage more constructively with the ongoing things that relate to change, because that's consistent in life. Yeah.
So in taking first steps towards peace building, initiating peace building program, do you have to first deal with elements like collective trauma?
Yeah, so you know, I think that it might be helpful, because this title also has peacekeeping in it, which isn't my area, is that, you know, something we can think about is, for all of us, you probably got different things in your mind that you're thinking about. And like Jill, you said, it might be about how you deal with legacies of the past and the collective trauma and so forth. But, you know, there's that sort of lived history and the very distant past. We begin with an acknowledgement, because we acknowledge that the problems today are continuing legacies of past violence and dispossession and marginalisation that become steeped in our institutions and our responsibility to respond to. Or we see it as a problem that gets explained in a modern way. Oh, you know, certain regional area issues or access or services or responsibility, you know. So there's different ways you can analyse any problem. And so the idea is that for many decades, when we talk about conflict resolution, it's like when the conflict's in a critical stage or in a crisis or protracted, you know, these conflicts that go on. And that's really important work, because where there's that level of violent social conflict or any sort of high intensity of negative conflict, of course you want to address it and address the crisis and the issues, but sitting around that are the relationships and that immediate context that it sits within. And that usually relates to things that have happened in the recent and distant past. So there's always important work to be done on understanding better the context of the conflict, but also that holding in mind that the response to the crisis or the issue might sit within a bigger problem. So, you know, we can address an issue, but maybe we've all had that experience where you approach an issue in the workplace from one person, but maybe there's 10 that are experiencing it, you know. So is it an issue that's then addressed? Well, not really. It might be managed within the system. And that's where it goes wider. So when I think of peace building, I think about that continuation of addressing problems at that level, but also if we wanted to address what's happening there, there's longer term work that needs to be done in that subsystem that exists with the family or the organisation, or, you know, more widely than that. And as it goes on, so peace building speaks to the work that we do, and a lot of the development and aid work is trying to address some of those drivers of inequity and so forth. But also with an understanding that, you know, if we're not thinking about the whole system, the governance structures and so forth, as a complex system, then we're not really going to make a difference, because, you know, we can learn from the, you know, this sort of knowledge that if we don't understand and engage those who are best placed or most affected, then we don't have sustained outcomes. And that's why, like, engaging women and girls and in peace processes has been so emphasised, because we know what happens when they're not. We don't have political settlements that address issues. We just recapitulate power struggles and certain interests. And so I think that, yeah, that peace building isn't at the exclusion of those other things. It's just that my interest, and maybe because it comes from an interest in the things that are a bit more wider than just the process of coming to some sort of agreement or whatever. It's like, how do we address some of the things that gave rise to the conflict? And it takes a long time. So it has got that generational aspect that we can't always work with. Not everyone's placed to work with all those parts, but I do think, you know, there was that whole period where there was a lot of emphasis on, of course, do no harm, and that carries in a lot of our work. But then there's other aspects in terms of our sensitivities around gender and conflict, and more broadly, increasingly, that desire to enhance how we think about conflict, to encourage greater integration of some of the things that also need to happen that could potentially, if not change or transform some of those relationships or ways of thinking or ways of doing and being that keep us locked in often quite unhealthy situations. Yeah.
So given what you've just said, I mean, this was put to me to ask this question, and I was thinking it through. I mean, obviously, as with most things in development, peace building is quite complex. So would you term it in any way as a linear process? It seems to me so many subsets, it can't possibly be a linear process, but that was put to me that perhaps it can be seen as a linear process in terms of establishing peace building.
Yeah, so like you, I teach as well, and as a sessional, I've taught for a long time this sort of introduction to conflict resolution, as it's called, and it helps sometimes to talk about the way the field's developed in a chronological and linear way. Sometimes it helps to give people a sense of the spectrum of approaches. You know, on the one end, we're always negotiating, and that's us. Other times people intervene, and mediation and arbitration and peace building brings in more people, and so that can help. But increasingly, I want to resist some of that, because how do we work in an environment where you get asked to create projects and programs that have particular things in mind. They have particular time frames, and so it's actually practically hard always to speak in this way, but we can hold it in mind, and you can introduce ways of holding some of that complexity, or at least seeing the complementarity between what you're doing and others are doing, and how to create linkages. So with the linear thing, some of my colleagues have been talking about this sort of spiraling. So you might be working in a particular track, but how do you make links with, like, if you're working in on a community program of work, and there are some real issues with the types of policies or programs that, whether it's the donor framework broadly or Australian governmental funding, like, how do we make some of those connections and start to move others in that way? And that's what we've been trying to do over the years, is not that everyone has the same ideas or movement in mind, but and this relates back to the idea behind conflict resolution really, is how do we shift the idea from this sort of competitive zero sum, this is what we do, where, to holding space for others, learning to, I don't like this language always, but, and I'm sure one of your questions will get there, but how do we share power and grow power rather than compete for it? And whether that's at any level is a real issue, because we start to see things as zero sum, or as what you do takes some away somehow from what I do. And a lot of the ideas in conflict resolution are, if we're having problems meeting or understanding or finding ways to hold my interests and needs and concerns highly, and your desire to hold your interests and needs and concerns highly, then if we're just competing, you're never going to get anywhere else. And so that idea of more collaborative or constructive conflict resolution is to move people towards a space where other options could be generated, enough trust and understanding is built to then elicit or open up or generate space for other things to be possible. And it requires, like, a different way that we get taught. And this is my circular way of coming back to your earlier question. Yeah, I didn't feel like we were taught enough about collaboration, about listening understanding we learn to those sort of oppositional, more competitive dynamics, but we don't have enough value on this idea of growing and having a lighter touch in how we exist. And like I said, I think our long history can teach us a lot about that, but not necessarily our short history. Yeah.
It's interesting when you're talking about that. I was going to say, it's one of the things I was reading up in notes I was making about peace building. One of the comments, one of the lines, I guess, was that peace building requires effort from political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions and security practices which are complementary and mutually reinforcing.
Yeah.
Is that in fact what happens in reality? Complementarily and mutually reinforcing?
Well, this is the potentiality, you know, and you know, a lot of the ways that our systems are organised is we get siloed, so it actually is really hard. I mean, even within the university, the initiative for peace building, we're multidisciplinary and so forth. But then it's always, so where do you sit? Who's your head of school? And they're trying to work out exactly, because that's how it's structured. And similarly, I've had a sort of strange path, like I said, this sort of coming out of a statewide system when I was working in transcultural mental health before peace and conflict studies. I then worked for an NGO, but I've always liked research. I'm actually really believe in participatory and evidence-based, but grounded in practical wisdom and knowledge. And so I always saw a role for university, for research, to influence policy. And so I always tried to keep engaged across those levels. And I agree with you completely. It is there in what we need to do, but it's not always enabled in how things work. But I do think it's getting better. Like we have increasingly, we try to do things that are not, this is track 1 and elite level, this is track 2 and this is grassroots. And I think that was important in the 80s and earlier on, where we were trying to emphasize the value of, you cannot just work at one level without understanding the importance of a bottom-up approach. And I think that's there. But again, this goes back to your linear or complex idea. And I think that, you know, how do we enhance our linkages across areas? How do we try to influence and complement and reinforce across those lines? And I do think there's so much work that needs to be done in that area. So I don't say that that's how it works, but I do really, there is so much benefit in that, and so much potential, because a lot of our issues are interconnected. Yeah.
So in terms of the outcomes, the positive outcomes you've had across time in terms of peace building, do you think that you've achieved more with governments, or in fact through NGOs, social change organisations, grassroots community people, in terms of actually getting good outcomes, positive outcomes?
That's a difficult question.
No,
No, but it's not. It's like so I like I said, I started off with a very top-heavy international lens that I was given, but my personal experiences were different. Over time, I would say the impact that I've seen when it works well happens when there are those encounters that do influence. Because I started off, for example, when I went to Cambodia and worked with this local peace building organisation, and for early career people. So when I did that work with the young Serbian and Croatian people, I was doing it from a place of my own experience and interest. And around 2003, there was this incident in Cambodia where a Thai actress had said that Angkor Wat, one of their really important temples, belonged to Thailand. And these young people went and, you know, they burnt down Thai businesses, and so the peace builders, in the local Cambodian peace builders who'd been working on a different agenda, you know, were like, what is going on? These people, young people, hadn't really lived through the Civil War and the Khmer Rouge genocide. What's going on? And there I was with my little second and third generation work that I'd done that sort of resonated with the director, this Softplay Nam, who was the director at the time. And so we were sort of talking about, well, maybe that's what we do. We just think about, and we work with young people, and we take it from a place of understanding better what's happening, and then what programs could be built from that. However, when we started to do that work, we found that we couldn't get access unless we, you know, had encountered the local chiefs, worked with the provincial government and the authorities, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Youth Education and Sports. And so this project went for years. And it was really instructive because, you know, we tried, you know, I'll always remember the person from the Ministry of Interior, who was so important because you need the permission to continue doing it. And he came along finally to one of our workshops, and one of his children, when he got home, commented on language he used. And they were like, that was really well, you know, that was great, Dad, or whatever. And he came back to us and said, oh, you know, yeah, you know, realized it wasn't highly political. So I think that's often a barrier. People think it's highly political. It's always politically engaged because we're every day we're politically engaged. But the point I'm trying to make is that we had to work with a range of stakeholders and actors, but we ended up with a memorandum of understanding from the Ministry of Education to do peace education in secondary school curriculum, but it never got funded because the government didn't have money. But I saw that as a real success because people came on board in their own way with their own interests and roles and so forth. And similarly in Australia, if I can say, having been out of Australia for a time, when I came back, I started working on a project that looked at Australia's diplomatic experiences in conflict, and this was with DFASH and Melbourne Uni. And that was a 5-year project, and we interviewed a lot of current and past DFASH, you know, WiAD and other personnel about what that experience was, and looking at DFAT internally, the structures and policies. But it really drew my attention to the fact that DFAT, diplomacy and aid, have been decimated over successive governments. It is threadbare. What we do with very little is actually largely quite extraordinary. And so that became a real focus of what we did in terms of raising an understanding of it's one thing to think about the role of conflict prevention and peace building in Australian foreign policy, for example, but a lot of us are working from budgets that come out of our aid allocations, and they are minuscule. And so think about, like, if we don't also support the rebalancing of all of our arms of government, we don't have that sort of central role that dialogue plays, that addressing drivers of inequity in our country and region play. We can work as hard as we do, but there's so much more we can do if we shift how we see that. Yeah.
It's interesting because it's amazing when you work in development and you work on certain projects, it's amazing how resourceful you become
Yeah.
and how adaptable you become when you have very limited money
Yeah.
because of the limited budgets you get out of DFAT and what have you.
Yeah.
In terms of funding, it's amazing how resourceful
So
you
just
can get
think
with
for a
networking
minute, we
and
don't have to
stakeholders.
share it, but
One
you
of my
know,
favourite
think about what it
expressions
would look like if
Mm.
we grew,
Oh yeah.
you know, our overall allocations, how we see the role within our own sense of positionality in the national sense, but in our region. And if we shift how we think about our relationships to really meet the needs and desires of those we work with. And that's coming back to your earlier question too. That's how I see security. I see it in that much more holistic sense. And I don't see that we've got the right imagination for how we think about how best to meet our collective interests in the region. I think you all do, but I think, you know, collectively we're still a bit we're really outdated in how we're thinking about pursuing peace and security. Yeah.
It's interesting you say that about government though, because with the recent publication of the Defence Strategic Review, AFBID recently came out and said that diplomacy and development were key measures in any deterrence against war. Do you think the government takes much note of that as significant note of that in the way they think about conflict resolution, peacebuilding, when they do put that in terms of strategic defence?
Yeah, a lot of us who have been labouring in this space are quite hopeful that we'll keep forging more space in this area. And if you think about, like I said, that, you know, Commonwealth allocations to diplomacy have been really thin for a long time. To aid, they were reduced by, you know, I think about 50% over the past 25 years. So when we rebuild that within government, I think there's a real role for us outside of government or in government to be useful in the shape that that takes. And I think ACFID and others have been strong on this because, again, with the Defence Review, we've had infinite amount of discussions on logistics about aspects of our military strategy that are inane. They don't matter, but we spend so, and they, when I say they don't matter, it's, think about the scheme of things. We have these public debates, but I wonder at times whether people really get how disproportionate it is, because to take it seriously, and Penny Wong has, as our foreign minister, in various speeches taken it quite seriously. We see a lot more, we actually see peace and peace building appear in documents. But when we did our DFAT review, a lot of people probably won't even realise we don't have a policy on peace building and conflict prevention. We've got things like a 2011 policy guide, but it's nothing that helps guide us. And the stories we got from people historically in AusAid, in DFAT over the years, a lot of the good work we did is really ad hoc and inconsistent. It comes from the good work of people at a time or under a particular head of mission or with particular guidance and advisors, but the story's really uneven. And so if we want to take it seriously, we've got to think about DFAT on one part. How do we build greater capacity within the department? We lost a lot of people with specialist knowledge. We need generalists and specialists, but that takes time. We need points of contact. We don't have a unit, when Trudeau came into power in Canada, he created, a point of for peace and conflict and ministers across that portfolio. We don't have a lot of those things that others do to try to work created particular whole of government funding for this work. And that takes time, but I am I really do think that we've got a role to play in the shape that that takes, the story we tell about the work we do. And that going back to your complementarity and reinforcing role, because whilst we've been forced to argy-bargy around this small space of work, if we grow it, there's so much more we can be doing with others. Yeah.
I find it interesting you said that about we don't really have specific or dedicated policy towards peace building. That when you think of, I mean, immediately to my mind, and I know it's for decades now, but Ramsey comes to mind.
Yeah.
And you think, given that was such a major, I can't think what the word would be, a major project, if you like, or program on part of our Defence Force, or part of our government.
Yeah.
I'm surprised they didn't then develop, if they didn't originate with one, they didn't then develop off the back of that a strong peace building and peacekeeping policy.
Yeah, and I would say the same for Bougainville.
Exactly.
But so and I think it draws our attention to, like with Ramsey, there's other stories. Like if you look at the types of reviews and research and work done by Solomon Island researchers and practitioners, you get a different sort of understanding of what the story is, because it continues, you know. And one of our colleagues in the work that we did, Bob Breen, who's sort of Australia's historian on peacekeeping and engagement, he really said that the good things, the really good things, there's lots of different aspects of Australia's role with others, of course, in the Solomons, was a chance to really rethink a more whole of government regional approach to how we engage when there are crises and conflicts. But where we fell down is we don't have that, I think, enough learning with others. So we can have a particular experience, but what would it be if we kept evaluating that with others? So, for example, in some of the work that we're doing with our colleagues in the Solomons, I mean, a lot of Anouk Wright and I wrote a little bit about when there was all that concern about China's military pact with the Solomon Islands. And that was, tensions were escalating, and Australia was responding really strongly. And we wanted to sort of hit a pause on those discussions. But the discussions you have, like the Solomons had a whole lot of different perspectives, and I heard there's others with this sort of sense as well, that, you know, depending where you are in the provinces and so forth, it's not a uniform, this is the Solomon Islands government perspective, this is the Australian government's perspective, this is what China's doing. And so I think, you know, the region keeps changing, but the very local context changes. The context is so important because people are really struggling with, communities are climate impacted, they're experiencing all these different changes, and the actual realities are very different. It's not what will happen, things have already changed. And so how do we constantly renegotiate our identity and place? And I think that's the conversation we're not having in Australia, because historically we've had particular alliances and ideas about how we work. We've also had experiences where working with others in regional responses tells us how important that is to others, or, you know, when we know that there are different things that really support the same interests we pursue, and that, so I just think that there's a lot Australia has done and can do, but the political will has waxed and waned. And I think we're hopeful that, you know, we just keep going. And I do think that we've got to push for some sort of articulation in our foreign policy, because it does trickle down. It's an enabling environment. If we've got a policy that prioritizes and values because it then does translate to what people are supposed to do to fulfill that vision. And to get to that vision, we've got to reimagine our approach, because at the moment it is a highly securitized, militarized idea about our posturing and our positionality, but it doesn't need to be. It's one part of what we do.
So do you find that as part of the, like, a government mindset in terms of that whole, like you say, that idea of posturing and a certain way of dealing with stuff that doesn't necessarily need to happen? Is that particularly a government mindset?
Well, look at our media. You know, we had the Red Alert series, which was a panel of 4 people with the same opinion, you know, warmongering, and it's really harmful. It's not based on actually different perspectives about Australia's security situation. It completely leaves out, like I said, it leads us to conversations ad nauseum about submarines, you know, and other types of aspects, Australia's defence capacity, but there's so much other things that are important, you know, and so the media has a massive role, because we hear when, China increases its military budget, but we didn't hear when they increased their diplomacy budget by 12%. You know, was that in the news? Or quick, let's race to increase our budget by 12%. It's a different, so we all do have a role, because we bring up or challenge narratives that take hold. And I think that's where we do have a lot of opportunity too. And it's not combative or negative. It's actually saying, we do a whole lot of other good work that has a whole lot of influence, maybe less visible. We were, one of the recommendations we had also to DFAT at that time was, how do we, and it's also, again, the resourcing and so forth. And I'm talking a lot about DFAT. I hadn't planned to, because there's all this other stuff we do, but I do think, that is one shared part of it, that you probably have done a lot of the work that's really good, but less visible, but speaks to really important ongoing relationships that matter and continue to matter. And it's a challenge for all of us, to think about that. But I see opportunity in creating, like with the initiative, the uni is a good way for us, we feel, sometimes to hold conducive spaces, to have conversations that bring together practitioners and researchers and people in government and the humanitarian sector. We've been doing that in relation to the situation since the coup in Myanmar in 2021, and we've been asked to do it in other ways. We've worked alongside ACFID and other actors to put in a submission to the International Development Review, and in some ways doing our own thing and then echoing shared points when we can, and trying to know more about what others are doing in that space. And Australia doesn't have a strong tradition of peace and conflict studies within its universities, and that's really lamentable. So we also hope to grow that a little bit. And for those of us who studied abroad, wouldn't it be nice to study here more if we could? There's a real unevenness in our work in the field, but also for people wanting to come into the field. How do we encourage an imagination for all the different work we're doing? We've all got different stories of how you come into it. But I see, and now it's over 20 years, and some of those relationships, like the people I worked with in Cambodia, I still work with and partner with on a range of things, but at very different levels to what we used to do. And that's the thing I love about the work as well. You're not your role, you're not your organisation, you work within them, and you find your place and you work out what your little part of the story is. Like, you know, I sort of took a long time to really feel comfortable about a bit of humility around what you can do, what you can't do, and how to, you know, how to move forward in that way. And I know that this group is also interested about women supporting women in leadership roles, and you know, a huge part of my experience has been some key people who took an interest in me. So I mentioned Di, who was my supervisor back in the 90s, but then thought of me when I was working in Cambodia because there was an opportunity to do some work in mainland China on a conflict resolution program that was starting, and she thought that I might be suited. I went across and then spent a month every year for the next 11 years on that program, and ended up doing my PhD on it because I thought, we're doing all this work on peace building in Southeast Asia and China's involved in everything, but not part of our network of peace builders. And so what have we got to learn? And I did my PhD on understanding Chinese perspectives on contemporary conflicts in China. And so what were they understanding? As a lot of them were development related, about unequal development, inequity, corruption, all those things that we're grappling with, and how are they approaching it? What do they see as those things? And so that led to an ongoing relationship, not just with that group, but with a whole range of people that came through that. And they're the sorts of things I'm proud of, because it's not about being proud, actually. It's about, they're the things that matter to me in the work, that you know, a lot of people come into the work and move, but generally are still working on related areas. And, you know, whether you end up again doing economics, you know, you might find that you come back to things that you did, but in a different way. And that's where I see that sort of the importance of the relational peace building, not just what you do within an organisation in your role, is that if we can also think about ourselves as more collectively engaged, then you can hold that integrity across different roles. And, you know, at the university, some of the work that we do has its legitimacy and credibility because of the extraordinary partners that we have. It's actually not what we're offering outwards. It's like, what's the opportunity if we collaborate? Because, as you know, when you're working on a lot of projects and program work, you don't get to do some of that reflective learning, comparative learning with others who might benefit. We do a lot of comparative learning, whether it's you know, ex-armed resistance groups who have transitioned to political parties, talking to others engaged in armed conflict, how you do that, or whether it's people working on trauma-informed approaches to peace building, or arts. And like, there are different things that mean a lot more if you're learning, not necessarily the context being the same, but at a particular point in time there's an issue. And a lot of the academic research and work still remains predominantly from particular sites. So we're not yet good enough about sharing examples from the incredible diversity within the Asia and Pacific region. And so we've got a role in that too. So how we connect others and share that learning. And then that's where I think we'll build up some of our capability, but through with others, not what we think we can do by ourselves. Yeah.
Just something you said early on about it's important to include women in the process, in the decision making, like from the community and stuff, and from grassroots.
Yeah.
Have you also found, because you also said in terms of you didn't realise coming into this that you could have a career in peace building, have you found from that, the other side of that is that like yourself, were there many when you started out, many women, and are there many women working in peace building from that, from your level, from that operational level, as opposed to also looking for women to be involved on the ground in the decision making? Are there many in the program delivery and creation?
Yeah, there are, and increasingly we see the value in networking better. So, for example, one example is around women who are in mediating roles, women who are mediating, and traditionally that evokes for people this idea of big man mediation, you know, that top level, which is just, you know, not actually the realities of a lot of the facilitative mediation work that gets done at the community level. But then for those women who are mediating at that sort of level, what supports and learnings do they have? And so you'll see now there are different mediator groups like Southeast Asia women mediators who are coming together much more, sharing experiences. We've got a mediator network in the region of women. And one of the reasons for that, again, is that you sort of realise, so for me, I sort of feel lucky, and it shouldn't be based on luck, I think, of who you encounter, but I felt lucky that I had particular mentors. I worked for easily one of Australia's best mediators, who's very unknown in Australia, but very well known internationally. And her name's Emma Leslie, and she's she heads up the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies in Asia program, and she's been involved in all the government of the Philippines, Moro Islamic Liberation Front mediations. She's done work in a range of contexts, and currently in Myanmar, and they're less visible for a whole lot of reasons. You know, I recently was speaking to Tecla de Silva, who is the national consultant in Timor-Leste for women, peace and security, and they're part of that network that I was just describing. And so part of that is also what helps sustain you in your work, because it is really hard and on a whole lot of levels. Essentially, gender, like conflict, is, you know, about power dynamics. So you encounter them in the context you're working in, and you encounter them in how they play out in your role as well. And so that sort of sensitivity to the processes we lead, the people that are with us, and the context that we're working in. And so I think it really helps to have people around you that support you. There are certain things I do really differently now based on the experiences I had when I was younger. So a lot of things I kept interpreting as personal experience I was having, rather than gendered experiences of the role in my work. Yeah. So I spent my 20s being really shocked that this kept happening, my 30s really pissed off that it was still happening, and my 40s really quite angry that we're still having conversations. So how do we then enable others to get much quicker to the systemic, the cultural, and then the constructive guidance on what you might need to push back on? And that's where I liked, when I liked the idea of this group, because it's across the spectrum of times. And, you know, for me at the moment, I've got people that I call where I go, this is my quick analysis of what's happening. And I want someone to then say, no, it sounds like you're seeing exactly what you're seeing. And, you know, because it takes, like I said, I grew up really introverted, but when it came to issues I felt I should speak up on, I did, but I'm inherently still introverted. So it's this funny thing where even as an adult, I I sort of have to remind myself, no, you lead the way that you want to lead, because we need people who do things differently. And then I hold my ground, you know. But it's this dialogue that I don't think happens unless you're outside of what's expected of you. And this is again what I mean about conflict. We respond to conflict out of ways in which we think we're meant to respond, but actually, why should we? We know that it's not necessarily always constructive. We know that HR don't have the answers. We know that families are complex, and you've got a sibling that avoids conflict. And, you know, my sisters used to say, what, you're doing peace studies, you're so conflictual, you know. But I'm not. It's just that I would raise things as they needed to be raised. And so there are those funny things that happen at the very personal identity level. But then I find that actually I've had really good experiences of working in teams and on projects and in collaborations that I want to recapitulate in my context. And so what do I need to, you know, push back on? Or, you know, what culture, what environment do we help create? What experience do we give to others that we would have liked? You know, I left Cambodia at a time when work was really good, but I was really worried that because I was single and without a family, I was really with a couple of other people in the same situation. We were doing a lot of the traveling, a month here, 6 weeks there. And then I thought, okay, I'll blink and I'll do this for another 10 years, but that closes off other things I might want to do. And I've got a 10-year-old that's testament to that. But at that time, that was really hard, because when I raised it, a lot of people leave a job or transition because things are bad. And so I was having to explain at a time when things were really good and I loved what I was doing, why I just wanted to do something else and see if I could have another part of my life open up. And whilst that was really hard, like I said, I've ended up working with those people in a different capacity and role, and all of the good is there. It's just morphed into a different relationship. But I would have liked some conversations early on that countered that idea that you just can do everything and you just work harder and you wear more hats and you just, you know, and you fall in a heap and you're not good to anyone, you know. And a lot of us have burnt out at particular times, and it might come from the work or it might come from other things that are happening. But how are we sustaining ourselves in a field that has so much good in it? But a lot of people don't also understand, because why would you put your, you know, I had family that were really quite worried about what I was doing. So they'd say, how was your flight? They never asked about what I was doing, you know. And then your identity's changed because of the things that you do. But how do you be your whole self when you return home or you travel? How do you travel and find ways to feel like you're growing and changing and holding space for that? Because it hurts your soul, it hurts your spirit, and some of the space doesn't let us discuss those things, or, you know, look for another job, or find a job, or you know, or go back to study. And it's not actually it's probably not the things we might want to be talking about. We might want to be talking about the struggle that, you know, we might be going through. Or, like I said, I every now and again rethink how I'm managing myself in systems that aren't enabling, you know, all the time, or in relationships that trigger certain things that, you know. And so I do think that there's other things that you can talk about with coming back to women in the roles, because it's not just women, it's gendered systems. And, you know, we've got forms of masculinities and ways of being that restrict even how we work with others on issues that are really important. And so I've always been someone who I don't necessarily always say, oh, I'm, you know, a gender person, or I'm this, or I'm that, because I really want to, which I am all those things, but you often get asked to be something. And so, you know, I hope you don't experience it as often as I do. Or, oh, well, women, yeah, you're on the team, so tick, you know. And I just think, you know, and it happens really regularly, you know, but it's with the women, peace and security part, it's actually a much more holistic agenda about prevention, inclusion, process, and a whole range of other issues. But this problem of women not being at the table, a lot of women mediators are saying, well, that's not the table we want to design and the process we want to be involved in. And I love that, you know, I love that it is important, but it's not the only indicator of engagement. And how do we raise the visibility of all the other forms of processes that take place that are important to influencing what is seen, especially by those most impacted, as the issues and the needs. And yeah, so there's different roles. So it's not just mediating, it's also, you know, raising the visibility, support, you know, providing support, being a resource person. These are other aspects I think that are really important. Yeah. And depending on what you're good at, or what your place is. And yeah.
We should probably start to
Sorry.
But
yeah.
But one of the things I did want to sort of finish up with was talking about, obviously, your work in the Peacebuilding initiative at Melbourne Uni, and the am I right with this? The Interdisciplinary Centre for Peacebuilding. I just wanted to wrap up with that and talk about it. You mentioned before that it's still, or you feel it's still fairly unique, certainly at university level, in terms of what it is. So you're obviously called upon a lot from everything you've said. You're obviously a lot of work, and you're called upon a lot across the board internationally for the expertise that comes out of that and research and that. So obviously, have there been pretty much totally or for the most part, positive outcomes of that centre and of developing that centre? And can you see it actually therefore expanding to other universities?
I would hope we expand even just within the university at the moment. Alongside the initiative being established in 2020, there's an acknowledgement, of course, there's a whole lot of people across the uni, students and staff doing work that relates to this area. So providing an opportunity for that type of cross-fertilisation is great. And we've got a whole lot of people that affiliate with the initiative. We're still relatively small as a team, but the thing I love the most, like I said, is about one aspect is the research and another is the teaching, which takes longer to really build up some of those programs of study and work. But you know, we can do more immediate things around growing our offerings for people working in the field, having more Australian-based but regionally grounded opportunities for professional development and so on. But the engagement part's really important because that's where you're being useful, you're, you know, translating some of that into things that are seen as useful for your various stakeholders, and that's where I see us growing. So with some of our partners, we're moving in to do some work in Bougainville, for example, that is a really wonderful team with some of our Bougainvillean counterparts, and you know, with Anouk that I mentioned in the Solomons, we're bringing together some of our Pacific researchers and friends to talk more from the city level about some of the patterns of protest and riots and resilience that we're seeing, and how do we understand that better and support it. So those areas of growth as we get bigger are really exciting, because it's like I said, it's not just you know, at a university level. Of course, it's important for research, but it's applied research. It's research that draws on a lot of the experience in our region, that is communicated in different ways, not just focusing on scholarly outputs. It's the type of conversations we can have that lead to collaborations for policy development and programming. And that's where I would like to see that growth. And alongside of that, you know, I think it would be wonderful if there was greater support to this area in universities, and that, you know, if you're doing development studies and you've got a particular interest in peace building, that's open to you, you know, and because there's so whether, or if you're doing engineering, or if you're doing, you know, music. So we've got Gillian Howell in the School of Music, who's going to grow the arts and peace building work, because you know, she does all this work around youth and music, and Leslie Pruitt does a lot of work on dance, and you know, I've got my own thing that I do around, and it's a whole other discussion, but food and peace building. So I've got this not-for-profit peace meal, and we bring people together around sharing stories of peace and conflict around food, and that sort of ability, very elemental connection that you have. And so I think there's, yeah, a lot of scope for all those different parts to grow, and I would hope so. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, look, we'll wrap it up there, Tanya. Thank you very, very much.
Oh,
That was
thank
a
you, Jill,
really
and
good
everyone.
chat. Thank you. Really interesting. I have a little present for you. We do this. This is very rare.
Oh, really? It's very nice.
Speakers get one of this. Don't mind the packaging. Sorry. You get a Women in Aid and Development mug.
Woo! I love it.
You can't get them anywhere else, only
I
from
love
Peacekeeping.
it, and I'll hold it in all my Zoom meetings. Beautiful. Oh, I love it. It's fantastic. It's so seriously packaged. It's me proof. Yeah. I thought it was a box of AA batteries at the start. I thought they're handy, but
Thank you.
thank you. I want to show my mug. Yay! I love it. I love it. Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Thanks.